So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Darkenia Waller, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of the Legal Aid Society of Middle Tennessee and the Cumberlands. I am also a longtime member of the Nashville Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and I am very excited today to be here to help moderate this forum of Nashville District Attorney candidates. We are excited as being a part of the Nashville Coalition Against Domestic Violence to invite our candidates here to share more about their vision, mission, and plans for the next 8 years should they be elected as the Nashville District Attorney. The Nashville Coalition Against Domestic Violence was created in 1992. It is a group, it is a composition of representatives from the Davidson County District Attorney's Office, the Department of Human Services, DUI School, General Sessions Court, Legal Aid Services, Madison Shelter, the Mayor's Office, Metro Probation, Night Court, the Metro Nashville Police Department, Public Defender's Office, YWCA, and more. These groups of concerned agencies and citizens within Davidson County share a desire to ensure that Davidson is the safest place for women and children and for families. And so as part of that mission, we are here today, again, to learn more about the candidates. So we thank you all so much for joining us. Just to kind of lay a few of the rules out and how we're going to flow today. All candidates here today will have an opportunity to respond to questions being asked. The order of candidate responses will change throughout the forum to ensure that no candidate is always first, second, or third. The response order will be randomly assigned to questions electronically and in advance of the forum. All candidates will remain on mute until it is their turn to answer the question. Each candidate will be allowed 2 minutes to respond to a question. There will be no opportunities for rebuttal. A verbal 30 seconds remaining alert will be provided. Candidates are asked to strictly adhere to the time limit. So with that said, I am super excited to jump right into our programming today because we want to hear as much as we can from our candidates. So I will begin with the first question, which will actually also be an introduction of our candidates. As I will not do that, I will allow the candidates themselves to tell us a little bit more about themselves. So the first question goes to Ms. Nellis, and the question is, please introduce yourself and answer the question. What are you most proud of in your own work to address interpersonal violence?
Well, good morning to everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. As Ms. Waller said, my name is P. Danielle Nellis. I am a multi-generational Nashville native. I have been a defense attorney, a prosecutor, and clerk for a criminal court judge, and that is the condensed version. While a prosecutor, I was assigned to the domestic violence unit for the majority of my time there, about 2.5 of the years, including a solo position in front of Judge McClendon, where I dealt with all of the bound over misdemeanors. What I am most proud of, I suppose, there's so many moments, is actually the learning and transformation that's happened over time. My first introduction to domestic violence was actually when I was coaching high school girls basketball. That's before the inception of the Family Justice Center or the JCAC or the shift in our courts. And this young woman had was facing an issue in her home where her mother was being abused, but she was not. And so we had no mandatory reporting. We had to connect her with resources. As a coach, you see your children and you see how things happen to them and how their performance changes when they're in homes. And so that really was an awakening for me. And as I did my work over time, both as a defense attorney, as a prosecutor, and then clerking for Judge Dalton, I began to notice and see how our system really was failing to understand the connection of some of these interpersonal violence issues in the household and account for them in the court process. I know the organizations here are certainly doing the work outside of the court process. as well, but in the court process, recognizing the nuances and that it is not always just Black and white and defendant and victim. And one of those stories, I hope we'll be able to get to it, has to do with two of my Sunday school kids, one who was charged with an aggravated robbery, but grew up in a household where his mother was abused, and then to see later his sister and her great success. So I'm hoping we'll be able to talk about that later, but just the growth and recognition and how that's come into play.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nellis. We really appreciate that response. And that will move us on to Ms. Myers, followed by General Fund.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Beth Myers, and I so appreciate this opportunity from the Nashville Coalition and all the partners. So I became a prosecutor because of survivors of domestic violence. Back in law school in 2006, I formed a partnership between the Legal Aid Society and Thistle Farms. And I met survivors of the most horrific domestic violence, sexual assault, child sexual abuse, and human trafficking. And those women inspired me to do what I do, not only in my career, but what I do outside of the workplace as well. So I have been a local, state, and federal prosecutor for the past 10 years here in Nashville. And the majority of my work has focused on domestic violence and protecting the vulnerable from the powerful, whether it's in the civil rights context, the human trafficking context, or where I started in the domestic violence division 10 years ago in the DA's office. The domestic violence division changed my life. I love working with survivors, and it informed what I did because when I was an ADA there, we started partnerships in local schools. The domestic violence division went out and taught kids about how to break the cycles of violence. And that led to the creation of Advocates for Women's and Kids Equality. So 8 years ago, I founded a nonprofit, Awake, and you can learn more at awaketn.org. But that organization was born out of my experience of being a domestic violence prosecutor and in working with survivors. And in the amount of time that Awake has existed, we have not only created a curriculum for kids and survivors, but we have drafted and passed 9 pieces of legislation, 8 of which directly impact survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. And as your district attorney, these issues will be a priority for my administration because I understand the gaps in the law.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Ms. Myers, we really appreciate that response. That gets us to General Fund.
Right. When I took office in 2014, as I was running, I knew what this office was doing with regards to domestic violence. People were coming in, staff was outnumbered. We only had 3 prosecutors handling a docket. Diane Lance had been working to try to find out where the gaps were as far as what the problems were. 80% of the cases were being flat out dismissed. 20% were sometimes leading to a conviction, but at the cost of re-victimizing the person who'd been abused by making her do something that she didn't want to do, by stripping her of her dignity and not giving her the autonomy that every victim deserves. So what I did when I took office was I said during the campaign that I would make domestic violence a top priority of the office, and that's what I've done. I've created a team of 22 professionals, 9 district attorneys, 9 victim witness coordinators, 3 members of a prosecution support unit, and a dedicated support staff. And what we do is at 8:30 in the morning, every day, we reach out to the people who were victimized in the last 24 hours and make sure that their voices can be heard. We invite them to come down and talk to us, meet with us, figure out not only what their story is, but where they're coming from and what they need right now. We then take them over to the Office of Family Safety at the JCAC, where they can be hooked up with services. And by having those early intervention meetings, right, what we're seeing is that we're actually addressing victim needs, so it's a victim-centered prosecution. Over 82% of those folks that come to those meetings show up for court, even if that court is 6 months to a year later. We're making a difference in making sure that victims are supported, and we're showing that with successful outcomes in court. We now lead the nation not only in how many victims show up for court, but how many successful prosecutions that we have. We'll talk more about this, I'm sure, beyond this 2 minutes, but that's what I'm most proud of during my tenure.
Well, this is going to seem like a continuation, but You're next up again, General Funk, for the next question. That question is, Nashville's 2021 Interpersonal Violence Summit recommended efforts that could increase domestic violence offender accountability, including reducing court delay, filing motions to revoke or increase bonds, tracking repeat offenders with the same or different victims, requesting GPS monitoring for high-risk offenders. What is your plan to increase offender accountability?
Sure. I have with me today Christina Johnson. She is the head of the domestic violence unit for the district attorney's office. What we want is we want to have a victim-centered prosecution, but part of that for a successful prosecution requires offender accountability. What we see is for us to count it as a successful prosecution, we can't just support the victim and make sure that she validates herself and restores her dignity, but we also have to hold the offender accountable. What we've done in that respect is we oftentimes work with the victims to see where they are with their family situation, with their relationship situation. We want them to be in a safe relationship, whether it's this one or the next. But we don't count it as a completely successful prosecution unless the offender has been held accountable in some way. We've gone through a treatment, a rehabilitation, going through making sure that they get a 52-week batterers intervention program, what types of supports the entire family needs. With regards to training that, are we tracking the offender statistics as far as recidivism, right, Christina?
Yes. So just the short answer is every single thing that you mentioned, we are doing that. So that's the short answer. Every single one of those things we're doing that.
And the actual rate, we're not only are we supporting the victims, but we're making sure that the defendant has some accountability with at least classes. Is about what percentage at this point?
66%.
So we've been working really hard on this, a team of 22 people working together. All of that is important. And one of the great things about having this opportunity to talk to the folks that attend this forum is to be able to demonstrate and to state the great work that this team of professionals is doing.
Thank you so much, General Funk. We really appreciate that response. That then sends us to Ms. Nellis, followed by Ms. Myers.
Thank you. So, as you all know, I have a written plan on how we move our city forward in our criminal justice system. It is based on 4 principles. Those are community engagement, prevention, transparency, and restoration. In 2013, I don't need to give you all this background, but you all know we did a significant study. You know, tons of resources were poured into addressing domestic violence issues here in our city. And you know that we have also worked in those other areas of interpersonal violence. And yet our statistics still indicate, despite those that were just given, that we have a serious problem addressing those cases, that those cases are dismissed at a disproportionate rate, and they also represent a disproportionate number of the arrests. So I would submit to you that first and foremost, community stakeholders like yourselves must have a true seat at the table, not just for the purpose of having to be there, but truly inviting you to come up with new and innovative ideas. I would submit to you that we must look at these cases through the lens of restoration, which asks what's accountability, what's harm reduction and healing, and we must expand those options. We know that right now, simply going through a BIP program for 6 months begins to change the behavior, but does not create the long-term supervision that is necessary. We must figure out how to reduce court delay. My understanding is we have over half of the cases dismissed at this point in a normal year, not accounting for COVID, where it was significantly higher. We have to move the process along faster. We know there's delay, particularly when people are put out on bond. I do believe that where people violate their bond conditions, we must file to have their bonds revoked, but in order to even make sure they're successful while they're on bond, we must expand our options for pretrial release, which includes monitoring and addressing root causes. We know that DV and some of these other issues are based on behavioral issues, and so we need to address those behavior issues and the root causes. We also know that those who are coming in contact with the criminal justice system, both the defendants and victims, are.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nellis. All right, Ms. Myers.
Thank you. So in terms of offender accountability, it's important to note that just last year in 2021, 87% of domestic violence cases were dismissed by the current district attorney's office. That is simply unacceptable. And I believe that's happening for a variety of reasons. And a lot of it is that new assistant district attorneys and people who aren't interested in domestic violence are being placed into that critical unit where there are extremely complex issues, and you truly have to want to work in domestic violence. It is a calling. It is a very special type of case. And there are a number of issues happening right now in the system that are problematic, that do not hold offenders accountable. I have heard time and again, and unfortunately we see stories in the news every day involving Vine and a failure of a victim to be notified that the offender is about to be released from incarceration. That is an issue, and I want to see precisely where those gaps are occurring in the system. In addition to that, bond reform. We have an issue with bond here in Davidson County. So many violent domestic offenders are being released and then they aren't being GPS monitored. There is no accountability for them so that we're worried about the victim's safety. There isn't that accountability because what's happening is there's not an analysis based on whether they're a danger to the victim and the community. There's an analysis based on how much they can pay to be released. And that simply shouldn't be the question. We need to be focusing on danger to the victim, and that will increase accountability for the offender as well. And then finally, there are gaps in the law, and there needs to be better training in the office for ADAs to understand, for example, a law that was passed by Awake, the Domestic Violence Offender Notification Bill, to dispossess offenders of their firearms and make sure that the staff is aware of that procedure and that we're indeed following it.
Thank you so much, Ms. Myers. Really appreciate that response. And I just to touch base here, I really do appreciate all of you all in your responses. And as we continue to try and determine what our future is going to look like, I mean, what is it that we will see in your 8 years? With that in mind, our next question is, and it goes to Ms. Myers first, so you get an extension on your question. That question is, Nashville's Interpersonal Violence Summit recommended efforts that could increase trafficking offender accountability and victim safety, including focusing on trafficker and buyer prosecution, targeted outreach to marginalized and underserved populations, and assisting trafficking victims to self-identify and seek assistance. What efforts will you make to increase trafficking victim safety and offender accountability?
So I love this question because human trafficking is another passion of mine. It intersects with domestic violence in so many ways. And it starts at a young age, usually involving child sexual abuse. So I was the human trafficking coordinator as a United States attorney for 32 counties. And that is something that I take extremely seriously because it's a complex issue, not just international human trafficking, which I have prosecuted, but the majority of our trafficking cases are occurring here right under our noses. And so many people don't understand the signs of human trafficking. So back when the NFL draft came to Nashville, I led a human trafficking task force that involved the business community, the nonprofit community, all levels of law enforcement and resource providers to make sure that when we were doing operations, we had people on staff there from In Slavery, from Thistle Farms, from Renewal House, and from Rescue One to make sure that we could get the survivors to where they needed to be, including drug treatment, because that's often another issue that intersects with human trafficking. Education on human trafficking in the community at large would be a priority. And the 3 pillars of my campaign are crime prevention, which includes human trafficking and education, civil rights, which includes, of course, gender-based violence, and restorative justice. And so we have to make sure that we're addressing the complex issue of human trafficking first through more education, then through more collaboration with the nonprofit community in that unprecedented way, which I have experience in doing and leading task forces. And I look forward to bringing that to the Nashville DA's office.
Thank you, Ms. Myers.
Thank you.
We'll next go to General Funk, followed by Ms. Nellis.
Sure. So first of all, the 87% dismissal rate for domestic violence, don't think that's exactly right, but I do know that our dismissals for failure to prosecute are only 20% now, leads the country in that. And with regards to domestic violence, our successful outcomes as measured the way I described, way over 50%. With regards to human trafficking, because that is a very real issue, it's a major issue. We started a program called Grace Empowered that deals with women who have been trafficked in a way to start treating them as recognizing that they are victims, not defendants. We do not prosecute folks who are victims of human trafficking for any type of prostitution offense. We make sure that they have a class where they can get a sexually transmitted disease test, where they can get some counseling, where they're offered housing, where they're offered opportunities for job training to be able to break out of the situation that they have found themselves trapped into. And we want to make sure that we get their supports. I've attended that Grace Empowered class a number of times. What's striking to me is that the folks that are in there, when I ask the groups, what is your number one need, every month we get the same answer: we need housing. And so that's what we've been working on, is trying to make sure that we can provide supports that can come up with transitional housing. I've dedicated one of our 70 assistant district attorneys, Sarah Wolfson Butler, to be the point person for all human trafficking cases. She has worked even with Ms. Myers in the federal office, and we've done our own successful state prosecutions. We've also met and done outreach with folks at the hotels and the nonprofits in order to make sure that we can identify situations as they come up to where we can then work with the police department to make.
Thank you so much, General Funk. Ms. Nellis.
Thank you. And, Nashville is unique, as we all know, because of our placement at the intersection of interstates, and because of our growth. We are experiencing issues in the areas of human trafficking and many others that we have not experienced at this level for quite a while. My solution to that is expanded invitations to the table. There are people already working in this space, and I don't think we need to recreate the wheel or call it our own by ourselves. We have to lean into the expertise of the community. There are people who are doing the work. We've seen that Operation Rose standing up. We've seen In Slavery expand in their work. We've seen members of this coalition do the work. But I think what we now need to do is pull in our businesses and invite them to the table so that we're expanding the resources that we have at the table, which is why in those first 90 days, I intend to invite stakeholders to the table to identify and align our resources to not only address this issue, but address the many issues we're facing in our criminal justice system. Too often we hear we don't have enough, but Nashville is not poor. And we have people who care deeply. And when we invite those stakeholders to the table, or ask our council people as they're inviting them, the businesses in, to make sure that they are required to resource some of the problems that they are creating in this growth, then we are able to make sure that we are meeting the needs of victims of human trafficking and survivors. I also agree that we must hold accountable those who are responsible for the trafficking. And yes, I understand that's a legislative issue. And yes, I understand that advocating to the legislature is often problematic from a DA's position, because we cannot go to them directly. We're going to have to do it in partnership with community-based organizations such as those represented here.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nellis. That brings us to our next question, and we will go in the order of Ms. Nellis, followed by Ms. Myers, followed by General Funk. The question is, evidence-based prosecution is an emerging best practice nationally. Nashville's Interpersonal Violence Summit recommended an increase in evidence-based prosecution, regardless of the interpersonal violence victims' support. Thorough use of corroborative evidence, such as body-worn camera footage, witness testimony, detailed photographs of injuries and scene, forfeiture by wrongdoing, and 911 call recordings. What are your plans, if any, to implement these practices or others within the work of your office? We begin with Ms. Nellis.
Thank you. You know, it is great when we have additional tools and we have additional evidence to bring forth prosecution. But in cases of interpersonal violence, and in cases generally, we must make sure that we are elevating the voice of victims and making sure that those victims understand that they have a seat in our driving prosecution and that they're not given false promises early and we're not overcharging early and setting them up for failure. So I think there is a balance. Whatever choice we make as far as using the tools available and the evidence available, we certainly want to zealously pursue cases, right? We want to hold people accountable for criminal behavior, but we never want to diminish the voices of victims. We know we have our Victims' Rights Bill, and that Victims' Rights Bill needs to have more teeth. So I certainly support that, but not to diminish the discretion of a prosecutor. So I think, you know, this is a balanced and nuanced conversation that we have to have together. As far as expanding the options for accountability, I certainly want to come back to that. What we know in these issues of interpersonal violence is they are interpersonal. You're dealing with family members, you're dealing with people who are close and intimate, and often the options on the table are jail, probation, nothing. And we know that those aren't the answers. And so we've got to expand the options for accountability that address not only root cause, but they reduce the harm to the victim and they foster healing. We have to implement restorative practices where the victim is willing so that we are indeed meeting those needs. And we can't say that that is off limits in this conversation, because what we've seen has not worked, unfortunately. And so we've got to reimagine and rethink the way that we are doing criminal justice, not just as a whole, but specifically as it relates to the nuances of DV, sexual assault, and other interpersonal issues.
Thank you, Ms. Nellis. On to Ms. Myers.
Thank you. So evidence-based prosecution is absolutely essential in intimate partner violence cases. It helps the victim and the survivor understand that they have support, that there is indeed corroborating evidence. And it's the prosecution and law enforcement's job to make sure that we have and use that evidence in a way that empowers that survivor. And so we have to make sure we're having training. I can't emphasize training enough, because training for law enforcement in evidence collection is crucial. Body cam worn footage is absolutely crucial, but not just on patrol officers. I would like to actually see body cams in jails on corrections officers as well. I've seen too many cases where corrections officers will sexually violate a woman. There will be a sexual assault, a rape that occurs in a broom closet outside of where the cameras are in that jail. So we have to be aware too of where those gaps in evidence collection are. I want more cameras for law enforcement, but that training is what is so crucial. So one of the pieces of legislation that Awake worked on was updating the strangulation law, because strangulation is one of those very tricky cases where immediately there may be no physical sign that there was indeed what is an aggravated assault, and one that can really be attempted homicide, literally trying to choke the air out of a person until they black out. So that training and evidence collection for law enforcement is just as important and will be a priority for my office, with law enforcement working with the Domestic Violence Division in an unprecedented way. Regularly scheduled trainings with nonprofits and experts such as yourselves to make sure that we are up to date on the most recent techniques for evidence collection to support victims in that prosecution.
Thank you, Ms. Myers.
Thank you.
General Funk.
Yes, evidence-based prosecution is really important, because many times a victim, because she's afraid to testify or because there's a threat that's made against her, she comes to court and either gets amnesia or decides she does not want to go forward for whatever reason, and we are reluctant to put that person, force somebody to do something that they don't want to do. But many times we can hold the offender accountable through an evidence-based prosecution that does not just rely on her testimony. We've been doing that for years. Christina, how long have we been doing that, evidence-based prosecution?
Since I've been on the team, it's been several years. We do strangulation training. We've done forfeiture by wrongdoing training. We've had federal prosecutors come in to training. we use every single tool in our toolbox to make sure that we hold offenders accountable. Our team has informed and educated ADAs who are passionate and committed about domestic violence. I know domestic violence has affected my home, my house, and I want to do nothing else except make sure that victims are supported and that offenders are held accountable. And we do, I just signed up for a training today on sexual assault. We are always doing training.
All right, so, and I have to take offense at Ms. Myers saying that we have people on the domestic violence team who don't want to be there. Every person in my office that's on the domestic violence team wants to be on that team. These are great lawyers who have their hearts broken every day because they care passionately about this work and the victims that they serve, as we try to make sure we give them a voice. But, you know, we've dealt with then Captain Drake, Captain Richter, then Captain Richter, Captain Bearden. We've worked with them and we have trained them. Body worn camera footage is crucial in order to make an evidence-based prosecution. And one of the things that Diane Lance and I talked about was how important body worn camera footage is, because when the defendant sees the footage and her complaint to the police.
Thank you, General Funk. Okay, have we lost our candidate? Okay. Well, we'll keep moving forward in the random assignment. General Funk will go first, Ms. Nellis will go second, and Ms. Myers third. Nashville's Interpersonal Violence Summit recommended specialized sexual assault prosecutors or a prosecution team. This is to ensure prosecutors are trained and skilled in sexual assault prosecution techniques, such as the collection and use of corroborating evidence besides DNA, addressing juror bias, direct and cross-examination techniques. An additional function of specialized prosecutors is to work closely with SART and MNPD and nonprofit teams. Please describe your strategies and plans, if any, around this recommendation. General Funk.
Okay, great. Let me slide over one chair. So we formulate special teams when there needs to be special training. To complete my thought, one of the things about domestic violence, if the domestic violence offender sees their wife or girlfriend give a statement to the police back at the day, they don't get upset about that use of that piece of evidence. They get upset if the person actually comes to court and testifies. And so it's a way to keep the victim of domestic violence safe. When it comes to rape and sexual assault, those are very serious and violent crimes. I've been working with Rachel Freeman at the Rape and Sexual Assault Center. I worked with Tom Tohill even before he retired and Rachel took over as the executive director. We met as recently as 2 months ago with Rachel Freeman and discussed this very idea of having a liaison that could make sure that the rape and sexual assault cases are prosecuted and that the serious cases like these can be handled by a designated prosecutor. Amy Hunter is my deputy district attorney. She's the person that I have the most confidence in the whole world. She was with me when I met with Rachel Freeman and we discussed ways to have better cooperation between the Rape and Sexual Assault Center and putting together a dedicated team to handle these types of cases. Amy, if you could talk just a minute about the results of that meeting with Rachel Freeman.
So when we met with her, we were talking about ways that we can partner not only with them, but also with the police department to create ways for us to have more communication among each other about which cases have occurred more, and for us to find out about those cases in a more immediate way so that we can follow up on them and make sure that we are collecting the evidence that we need very early.
Thank you so much for your responses there. Ms. Nellis, do I need to restate the question? Do you see it there in the chat?
Could you please?
Absolutely.
Internet issues today.
Yeah, no worries. Nashville's Interpersonal Violence Summit recommended specialized sexual assault prosecutors.
Kenya, are you still there?
Darkinia, you're frozen.
Apologize. I fear that this might be contagious.
Oh,
Okay. So going back, Nashville's Interpersonal Violence Summit recommended specialized sexual assault and prosecutors or a prosecution team. This is to ensure prosecutors are trained and skilled in sexual assault prosecution techniques, such as the collection and use of corroborating evidence besides DNA, addressing juror bias, and direct and cross-examination techniques. An additional function of specialized prosecutors is to work closely with SART and Metro Nashville Police Department and nonprofit teams. Please describe your strategies and plans, if any, around this recommendation.
okay, thank you. And hopefully we didn't go away. I think specialized prosecution teams are an excellent idea, right? Because you definitely need that institutional knowledge. I know in the office, many times people are moved around day to day. We used to joke on the DV team that every 4 to 6 weeks, there was going to be something different happening, a different team member. So we certainly know that there is a need for consistency in those spaces for sexual assault and that higher level of prosecution. But I want to be very clear. As we are training the people in the office and creating that specialization, we also have to take care of the people in the office. These types of cases are extremely traumatic for not only the victims as they're going through, but also the prosecutors as they are walking with the victims and carrying that secondary trauma. So there has to be space to care for the individuals. There has to be space for training, not just on the specialized, ways that we examine, cross-examine, collect evidence, use the evidence, but also making sure that we are culturally competent, that we are not treating certain victims with kid gloves because it's a high profile case, but we are truly caring for each and every victim. But in order to do that, I absolutely believe we must care for the people in the office. So a big part of my plan is certainly training. It is interviewing and understanding the skills and talents of the individuals who are assigned to different teams and going in, making sure that people are matched with their particular skill set and interests, because as people are interested in certain types of cases, they are more likely to stay in that space and have passion and advocate zealously for resolutions, and also to create more space for us to hear from the victims. Yes, we have the victim witness coordinators and all those people, but we know in the system overall, the space really hasn't been created for us to hear from victims and what their real needs are, or those options for accountability in meeting those needs.
Thank you so much, Ms. Myers.
I love the IPV Summit. All of those recommendations, I think, are absolutely crucial because it's not occurring right now. And if we haven't seen it in the last 8 years, we shouldn't expect more than we currently have. So I think it's important to be able to look forward with a fresh perspective and someone who does have the experience in bringing all of those people to the same group and the same conversation. And prevention is going to be key. So not just for the survivors, the law enforcement, community partners, the nonprofits, we need to make sure that we're focusing on how to prevent those crimes in the first place. And so that's where I want to focus so much of our attention on prevention so that we can get those numbers down overall in the long run as far as intimate partner violence. But in the meantime, that training is so crucial. We do have to make sure that people are called to that position and that they are where they need to be. I will not be hiring people into a specialized trauma unit such as interpersonal violence until I know that they have a desire to do it and that they have good experience in it as well. So not just hiring people fresh out of law school or a campaign manager or political staffer into a position that is crucial with a deep understanding. These have to be trained, specialized people, and we'll continue those trainings with experts and groups such as the participants in the IPV Summit. We need to make sure that we are using the most up-to-date evidence technique collections, and that we are going to the summits. The Interpersonal Violence Against Women Conference is a wonderful conference that I attended as an assistant DA, where you can learn about different techniques and trauma that are being pursued from all over the country. So not even just locally, but nationally, we can see best practices and make sure that we are employing them here.
Thank you so much, Ms. Myers. All right, so this moves us to the next question, and the order will be Ms. Nellis, Ms. Myers, followed by General Funk. Prosecuting cases of child sex abuse and severe physical abuse requires knowledge and training and takes years to develop competence and confidence in the work. If you are elected district attorney, how will you ensure your specialized child abuse prosecutors have and maintain the highest level of experience in handling these highly sensitive cases? Again, we'll start with Ms. Nellis, followed by Ms. Myers, and then General Funk.
And I think I touched on this even with the last question. We have to identify who is interested in doing these cases. They are very traumatic. They are highly specialized. And we have to care for not only identify the people who want to do the work, but we have to care for the people who do the work and create the space so that those individuals, as they carry the trauma and do the very difficult work, are cared for as well. Because we know hurt people hurt people. And so if you're carrying too much trauma, you will not be effective in your work. I think we have to make sure that we are training. Yes, we have to train in this specialty, but we also have to train on a core set of principles. And I think I know that's not happening currently. And so those 4 principles that I have stated before that every ADA must train on are community engagement, transparency, prevention, and restoration. So that we're looking at all the cases consistently across the board. And that's not to diminish the specialization required for child sex abuse and the physical abuse cases or the elder abuse cases or any of the other very specialized types of cases we're discussing here, the interpersonal violence cases. But it is starting with a clear foundation. Do you want to be there? Are you particularly interested in it? Are you trained in that space? Are you trained in all of the spaces? And then are you able to take on this specialty assignment? And then are you cared for so that you can care for the individuals who are doing that? We also have to create a healthy culture in the office where people are secure in their jobs. These are difficult cases, particularly if they hit the media. And so the people doing the work must know that they are supported in their decision-making processes and that the person in charge will stand with them even when it is politically unpopular. And so that is a big part of my goal.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nellis. Ms. Myers?
Child sexual abuse cases are some of the most complex and important cases that a district attorney's office does. Mostly too because they're interpersonal and they involve a child in a relationship with someone that they really trusted and loved. And so often a victim, especially a child victim, doesn't even realize that they are in fact a victim of this person that they love and trusted. And so in terms of training that specialized unit, I think it's important not just to look at the ADAs in the unit and making sure that that training is up to date and that we have trauma-informed care, but our victim witness team is so crucial in this area because that's the day-to-day community outreach, and then the advocates as well. So there should be a team that is surrounding these victims, and I know how hard the victim witness team works and advocates work in this space. But in terms of training, I think you just can't get enough. And I do think that it should be coming from experts from all around the country and looking at how best practices are constantly changing and we can do better. So often too, child victims don't feel comfortable speaking in court or maybe even being in court. And so we have to make sure that ADAs are prepared to handle getting up and speaking for the child. Reading those statements on behalf of maybe not even the child, but the family member. One of the more complex, high-profile cases that I handled involving child sexual abuse was United States versus Tad Cummins, which involved a teacher who fled with a student from Tennessee all the way to California. That case was so complex, but again, in the beginning, just knowing and recognizing that a child is not going to necessarily even recognize that they have been victimized at first. And so starting from there in that very basic training, and then working with our victim advocates to make sure that we have the most supportive, trauma-informed environment for victims and survivors.
Thank you so much. General Funk.
Okay, great. Slide over here. When I took office, we had a team for child abuse that included sexual abuse, physical abuse, and child porn that was 2 people. I immediately took that to 6 people because that's the level of priority I put on crimes against children. I also attached our chief investigator, David Ziccola, to that team because he has 12 years of experience in the police department as a child abuse investigator. I put our best people in charge of this team. Jen Norman, some of y'all may know her already. She was the head of that team for over 2 years. And Jen, if you would just talk about just training and conviction rate and the number of folks we have on that team.
Sure. Once I became team leader, General Funk sent the entire team to the National Crimes Against Children Conference every year and has been doing that. So every single person on our team was trained by people that are the foremost experts in the country. Additionally, we had more training within our own unit through our kids, with the police department, with all of the child abuse experts that we have here locally. We did a lot of internal training and made sure that we were talking to the best people. Everything about children testifying in court is the focus of crimes against children. We have experts that work with us. We use therapy dogs. We have, I think, expanded upon every possible resource in that area. And our conviction rate for cases that have gone to trial for that unit have been extremely high. I think it's over 90%.
Even if you count all the cases, it's 96 to 98%, sometimes even 100% in a given year. Ms. Myers has put out several statistics lately indicating that we dismiss 75% of child abuse cases. Let me explain that to you. The stats she's talking about are talking about counts of an indictment. So if we have a 10-count indictment and the person pleads guilty to 1 count and takes 50 years, and we've got several instances just like that, then that's a conviction. That's 100%. We have made the community safe.
Thank you, General Funk. So we'll move to the question about better intervention programs. Better intervention programs are currently the primary system through which our city addresses offender reform. What opportunities do you see for expanding and strengthening offender reform initiatives, including but not limited to better intervention programs? And please be specific in terms of what that could look like for you. We'll start with Ms. Myers, followed by General Funk, and we'll conclude with Ms. Nellis on this question.
So I know that Batter's intervention program is always kind of the first place that is often turned to in court, especially in first offense cases. But from what I've learned as a domestic violence prosecutor is that it's usually not a first offense at all. It's just the first time that the offender has in fact been caught. And so I think that turning to those programs and, hoping that they are getting, very good instruction. I know we have several Batter's intervention programs in the city. That is a great starting place because we want to prevent it from happening again. But that is only the tip of the iceberg in a domestic violence type situation. We need to make sure that we are getting the resources for the victim too, to recognize you're not going to solve a problem that took years to develop in someone who is being abusive in 26 weeks. You're just not. So we have to recognize and start from that space. I know that the YMCA and the YWCA too have excellent programs, too, focused on prevention And I think that needs to be the majority of our focus. And while a BIP is a form of prevention, it's after that has already happened. I'm going to create the DA's office first restorative justice unit to make sure that we can get all of the parties at the table, if interested, to make sure that we can get a solution too that may involve more of that GPS monitoring and some of those other solutions that are outside of the box that the offender will be paying for. Those are issues that we need to make sure victim safety has to be a priority. And so while yes, offender learning in a BIP program is absolutely part of it, that cannot be the end all be all. Oh, you're done, problem solved because you graduated from your BIP. No, it is merely part of the solution. And we need to make sure that the survivor is involved in that solution because she's the one who has to live it every single day.
Thank you, Ms. Myers. General Funk.
Okay, first of all, to complete my sentence, because Tina Fox has the fastest fingers in Nashville. If someone's got a 10-count charge for child rape and plead guilty to one, take a 50-year sentence, the stats that she cites would indicate that's a 90% dismissal rate. In reality, that's a conviction we've kept the community safe. With regard to matters intervention programs, you are correct that those are programs that need more study. I've worked with Diane Lance, and we're doing a study to determine whether or not these programs are actually effective in the ones that are being offered here in Nashville. It's clear that sometimes it's a situational violence as opposed to a domestic violence, a classic power and control, though most of the time it would be power and control if it gets to the level where the person is called the police. Matters intervention programs are not appropriate for strangulation because strangulation is actually an attempted murder. The person just didn't get away with it because if they strangle someone to the point of choking off their air or maybe even causing someone to lose consciousness, that's an attempted murder. It just wasn't successful. And that's not something for a 52-week program. Worked with Sharon Roberson. I've been on the board of the YWCA. We're active on trying to make sure that we give the appropriate counseling. And lastly, with regards to restorative justice, Diane Lance and I agree that restorative justice is not appropriate in domestic violence because the abusers are so manipulative and they know what to say in any setting, whether it's a circle, whether it's a meeting, whether it's with whatever counselor, they can be so manipulative. And then they get in the car with their victim and on the way back home, all hell might break loose. Domestic violence is not conducive to restorative justice. Now, that said, we do have a very successful restorative justice program in juvenile court, and we're working to see if there's some place in the country that develops a restorative justice program that can work in DV. We'll look at it, but I doubt it's going to be successful.
Thank you so much, General Funk. Ms. Nellis.
Thank you for that. Let me say that there is a small study out of Seattle, actually, where they tried a restorative justice program and they saw that it was effective. But the reason that it was effective was because first, the BIP was in place so that we could address the behavioral issues. And then if the victim wanted to participate, she or he was able to participate after the behavior was addressed. And I think that's what we're talking about here, whether we expand or strengthen BIP. We know that in 6 months, it is insufficient to change a behavior. What we know is 7 out of 10 kids, if they see DV in their house, they end up participating. So there's something about DV where we see the defendant as the defendant instead of recognizing that he or she is probably one of those 7 out of 10 kids. And so we know we're dealing with a childhood behavior that must be addressed first, and 6 months is insufficient. So we've got to strengthen that. I think there are ways to strengthen that. We do that through a pretrial assessment program. So as people are arrested for domestic violence, we create space where they are able to start on those classes. I understand many people are not willing, but if we have an effective assessment tool and a way to partner with organizations, we're starting to see results earlier. So as the cases are processing through, because sometimes they do take quite a while, we're at least addressing that behavior without assuming guilt for the defendant. As the cases come onto the dockets, we are not only recommending a 6-month program, but we are trying to hold people to the 52, where we really start to see years. But I think we also have to put BIP in with other wraparound services, because we know though DV, classic DV is power and control. We also know there are other issues. We see poverty, displaced housing, homelessness and displacement, insecurity, food insecurity, and things like that that also have to be addressed. And we have to care for the victims on the other side as well. Make sure that we are fostering healing and reducing harm for that victim as he or she is going through the process, and connecting them with the resources they need so that they can continue to be safe.
Thank you, Ms. Nellis. All right. The order of the next questions will start with General Funk, followed by Ms. Nellis, followed by Ms. Myers. And the question is, Nashville's Interpersonal Violence Summit stressed the importance of enforcing firearm dispossession laws for domestic violence offenders. What steps will you take to ensure that convicted domestic violence offenders are held accountable when there is evidence of firearm possession?
Great.
Start with General Funk.
Sure, Christina, come on back up. First of all, every person in my office understands that anyone who is convicted of domestic violence can no longer possess a weapon. We make sure that that is asked by the court. We make sure that forms are checked. We make sure that they dispossess. There are problems with the law with regards to how folks dispossess firearms. And in fact, we made some progress in the legislature until the NRA came in at the last minute and was able to stop certain progress 2 years ago with regards to firearm dispossession. One of the problems for a district attorney is who's going to go out to dispossess the firearm. It's not going to be an assistant DA, because I'm not going to put them in that position where they're in that adversarial situation with somebody who's angry and with a gun. It's not going to be a probation officer, I don't think. Obviously, we could work with a probation department, and it's not necessarily going to be the police department, though that would be the natural place, because I don't tell the police chief where to put the chief's resources. But it is a very important issue. And so, Christina, if you could just talk for just a minute, just a few seconds about what we're doing as a team with regards to making sure at least the forms are checked, so that in our lane, we're doing everything we can to make sure people dispossess.
Absolutely. In the cases where form is not filled out or not turned into the court, we've been working with Diane Lance and probation and our judges to have dockets where people are brought back to court to make sure that they are dispossessing or providing service.
You got 30 seconds.
Okay. So we have been working very closely to make sure that all of those gaps are closed.
Right. And so ultimately, firearms, we've got to get firearms out of the hands of the folks that demonstrated violence. We're doing all we can within our lane to make sure that the law is followed, and we're working with our partners to try to make sure that people can actually get out there and dispossess these folks.
Thank you, General Funk. Ms. Nellis.
So we know gun dispossession is a huge issue, and there are legislative barriers for us to be effective. But I also know there's some really practical things that must happen as cases are coming before the courts. We have the lethality assessment, and all too often we see that there's a weapon involved in the lethality assessment, and it's not included in a plea disposition, or it's not announced to the court. So that's one practical solution, making sure that every time there's a weapon involved, it is announced to the court. The judge is made aware that that is indeed the case. Certainly writing in that those weapons must be forfeited as a part of the plea agreement, and that it is non-negotiable. And that it is not just, pass it off to somebody else in the courtroom. Not that they have them in the courtroom, but you all understand what I'm saying. So there's some really practical things that we have to do as far as training with the unit. But I think there's also beyond that, recognizing the need to push towards a safer public. My goal is to make the modern model of prosecution in the South. And I say in the South because we have gun laws that allow just about everybody to have a weapon. So what are we looking at as far as the prevention, as far as the education, as far as some of the other community-based solutions to making sure that there are not weapons accessible all the time to the wrong people? So we know that guns in cars is a major problem. How are we making sure that guns are getting locked up and not getting in the wrong hands, which could eventually be used in a DV or abuse situation? How are we looking at it as a community and addressing the issue with guns overall? So I think we have to do it both regarding domestic violence cases, but we also have to do it in a larger community conversation, because it doesn't look like our legislature is going to be helping us in that area anytime soon.
Thank you, Ms. Nellis. Ms. Myers.
Dispossession of firearms is probably the most crucial issue facing survivors of domestic violence, because when a firearm is present in that type of situation, a woman is 5 times more likely to be killed at the hands of her abuser. Knowing that this is the case, a few years ago, Awake drafted legislation to create that form procedure that we just heard our current DA's staff member talk about. That form is actually created by that legislation that Awake worked on with community partners such as the Office of Family Safety and the YWCA. We had numerous partners involved in getting that legislation passed. And so to make sure that that procedure is followed in every single case would be crucial from the district attorney's standpoint. I will make sure that there is so much training on that dispossession procedure that we will be able to understand if there are any gaps in the system, precisely where they broke down. But the offender is required to list every single firearm that he has in his possession at the time of that conviction, because he's not allowed to possess it under state law or federal law. And so when he lists those, that form can then be shown to the victim, who can say, that's not accurate. Actually, he has 10 firearms and he only listed 1. If that's the case, you can have probable cause to get a search warrant to go and actually search that defendant's house to retrieve those guns. And he could even be prosecuted for perjury for making a false statement on that form in the court. So that tool is an amazing one that I believe right now is not being used to its fullest extent. And that is something that I would change under my administration. We can save a lot of lives simply by following that procedure and involving that survivor in the process of showing her that form and making sure that law enforcement then does go back and is able to dispossess those firearms from the abuser.
Thank you so much, Ms. Myers. Time has really gone, and we are actually to our last question of the morning. And the order will be Ms. Nellis, followed by Ms. Myers, followed by General Funk. Nashville, Davidson County is very fortunate in that we have a broad, engaged community of organizations serving victims of interpersonal violence, including those agencies who are members of the Nashville Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Describe how you plan to collaborate and engage with organizations in Nashville serving victims of interpersonal violence. Again, we'll start with Ms. Nellis, followed by Ms. Myers, and then General Funk.
In my policy platform, which is almost 20 pages of light reading, I say that we will invite stakeholders to the table. The ladies and gentlemen here, the organizations represented, are stakeholders. You all are invited to the table. But I'm also going to push for us to reimagine. We know that statistically what we have been doing isn't working, and I can only imagine how many of you feel that you have been banging your head up against a brick wall when the numbers tell us that we are dismissing too many cases, that the deaths by domestic violence are too much, when elder abuse is running rampant, where conservators really don't have options. I know you know those problems. But what we've been offered today and in the past have been the same old solutions. And so we've got to reimagine together the way we do criminal justice, not just in the interpersonal violence space, but overall. And so I invite you to reimagine with me. You have an absolute seat at the table. And I think when we invite all stakeholders to the table, we'll be able to expand our options, but also educate. You know, we've got to make sure that we are educating ahead of time. I told you all a story about coaching. Coaches know their kids. So how are we working with coaches in the community to make sure young people are educated? The story I was going to tell my Sunday school kid, he was type 1 diabetic, had mental health issues, grew up in a house where there was DV and a drug addicted parent, and nobody saw him when he was on the docket for all that he brought to the table. They only saw him for the robbery that he did indeed commit. But we need to be able to see every individual for the person they are and the many problems that many folks bring, and address those many issues holistically. We must hold people accountable across the board. I'm sorry, Tina, are you about to cut me off? Did I see a thumb? I apologize. So we have to address these holistically and see people and put people first in prosecution, no matter what they are going through. And in that way, we're able to make our community safer. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nellis. Ms. Myers.
Under my administration as district attorney, there will be unprecedented collaboration in the interpersonal violence field. We already have so many amazing nonprofits working and coalitions like the Nashville Coalition to make sure that we have the people at the table who need to be there, and the experts and the informed survivors and community advocates who are there helping inform the change that happens. But what I am going to do as district attorney will involve actually restructuring the office to make sure that we are assigning assistant DAs to neighborhoods so that they can understand the specific issues that are happening there. What we do know about interpersonal violence is that it's not location specific. It happens absolutely everywhere. So what I envision happening with that new restructuring of the office in determining why certain crimes are happening in certain areas, knowing that a common denominator is interpersonal violence, is making sure that those ADAs are also working in collaboration with the nonprofit and advocate community in those different meetings. We're going to have quarterly listening sessions in each of those precincts composed of all those neighborhoods where ADAs will be assigned to build relationships with those stakeholders, including, most importantly, the nonprofit and interpersonal violence community, which also encompasses law enforcement and trauma-informed care and resources for people, so that we can tailor resources too on the front end to focus our efforts on prevention, because preventing these types of crime through education and training is where we can win this and we can save lives. And that to me is the most important job of a district attorney, is to focus on that prevention and in saving lives. And interpersonal violence is the space that we can do it. Thank you all so much. I hope to earn your vote.
Thank you, Ms. Myers. General Funk.
First of all, with regard to stakeholders, I'm a board member of the Nashville Children's Alliance. Spent 6 years on the board with the YWCA. I worked with the Interfaith Dental Clinic. I'm on the board of Tennessee Voices for Victims. I meet regularly with Kathy Gurley at You Have the Power. Meet with Chief Drake regularly. In fact, I talked to him this morning. Most importantly, I meet regularly with Diane Lance. She is an amazing partner in this work, and we could not have the successes that we've achieved over the last 8 years without the work at the Office of Family Safety, Diane Lance, or her entire team. With regards to partners at the Rape and Sexual Assault Center, Roger Moore, Deputy DA, has been on their board. In fact, it was his idea for them to have the clinic there, which is essentially Our Kids, but for adults, where people can have dignity when they're having a sexual legal exam. Blushing, I don't have time in this wrap up to be able to let him talk about it, but it's amazing. You know, Portland, Oregon has their entire city leadership in town. I spoke with them for an hour this morning. They're here to study the innovations we've had both in domestic violence and our mental health services. And as a wrap up, you know, I know that there have been recommendations from the summit, but the reality is we've been doing that all along, and we're exceeding the recommendations, and we're always open to even better suggestions for us to help do our job even better. But we have an amazing team of 70 assistant district attorneys that are committed to victim services. I wish anybody could just follow, and you're all invited. You can follow Christina Johnson, our domestic violence team leader, as we support victims of domestic violence. You can follow super lawyer Jan Norman, and she is amazing. I don't know how anybody could say that she dismisses 3/4 of child abuse cases. You can follow Deputy District Attorney Amy Hunter as she's working with rape victims and with child abuse. You can follow Roger Moore and his team on the homicide unit. We are doing an amazing job with regards to supporting victims and fighting violent crime. That's where the resources of our office are, and I'm proud of the work that we've done for the last 8.
Well, you'll love this, General Funk. We are going to give each of you 2 minutes to wrap up your remarks today. We are ecstatic to have you here today, but we do want to make sure that you have an opportunity to share with us anything that you may not have been asked specifically that you want to be sure that this community is aware of. And so we will still have our stellar timekeeper, Tina Fox, on her job at 2 minutes, but we will go in the order of General Funk first, Ms. Myers, followed by Ms. Nellis. You each have 2 minutes to give your closing remarks.
Okay, great. It's amazing the work that the 70 assistant district attorneys have done and the successes that we've had over the last 8 years as we have reoriented ourselves towards supporting victims. We've won every big case that's come in front of the court, whether it's the Vanderbilt rape case, whether it's the Burnett Chapel Church of Christ mass shooting, whether it's the Waffle House mass shooting, whether it's the Dogwood mass murder or double murder, almost a triple murder that we just had in court 2 weeks ago. That's where our focus is, and we are dedicated to that, and we are unrelenting on that. Violent crime will not be tolerated in this community. We do that by making sure that these resources are placed here, but it's also by having collaborations with the Office of Family Safety, collaborations with the Metro Nashville Police Department and some of their specialized units, collaborations with the Nashville Children's Alliance. We can't do that without our safety partners. I'm proud of the innovations that we've been able to come up with over the last 8 years, because we are in a much better place and our safety numbers bear that out. Statistics are funny things, and somebody with an agenda can make a statistic say something that is completely misleading. But the reality is Nashville's safer than it's ever been, and we're doing a better job of supporting victims than we ever have. I appreciate the work of this group, and I look forward to continuing to work with you in the future.
Thank you so much, General Funk. And Ms. Myers.
So we have to ask ourselves as a community, are we better off than we were 8 years ago? And my answer to that question is a resounding no, we are not. I have not seen, unfortunately, out of this district attorney's office what we are capable of in terms of crime prevention, civil rights, and restorative justice. And I am excited about being this opportunity for change in this moment in time. And I think it's so important, especially in the interpersonal violence field, to have a person who has dedicated her career and passion to this very issue. This is an opportunity for Nashville. And I'm so excited because, as I said, I've not only dedicated my professional life to interpersonal violence, but I have in my private life as well. And so getting legislation passed on updating strangulation, on stalking, dispossession of firearms, child sexual abuse prevention, these are all issues that a district attorney can and should be working on a daily basis with community stakeholders such as yourselves. And this is something that you will see under my administration in an unprecedented way. Trauma-informed, new victim advocacy arenas that we've never even broached before. And that means listening to you all. That means listening to survivors and making sure that we are being receptive and that we are willing to change. And we need a new perspective. Things are not good in Nashville right now. And if you ask anybody out on the street, it used to be education a few years ago, but right now it's crime at the top of everybody's minds because it's increasing here in Nashville. And in the interpersonal violence arena is where we can really make a difference, because that is where we lose so many people, and it is preventable. I want to work on that prevention with you, and I hope to earn your vote on May 3rd to start that process. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Myers. Ms. Nellis.
Thank you so much. I am fascinated by the use of statistics. As the incumbent stated, I believe he's indicated a great success in that area, but we've had almost 1,000 rapes in the past 2 years, and only 212 were indicted in the past 5. And so I just want to be very clear about how we are failing. And we know, as people who work in the space, that what we're doing right now isn't working. For those who do not know my personal story, I'm running because I've lost family members to violent crime, but there's a part of my story that I don't stump on. And I'm simply going to say, me too. I understand our stories. I understand what it means to be a victim of violent crime and have been associated with it. And I have the professional experience to make the changes. I know what we're doing right now isn't working. I put forth the ideas to make the necessary changes that will reimagine our criminal justice system. I know in this space, we work on interpersonal violence, and you all are amazing experts and advocates in that space, but we have to also look at interpersonal violence in the larger context of criminal justice reform and public safety in our city, because they are indeed connected. As I stated with my kid who committed the robbery, we knew his background as well. And we know these backgrounds often lead to continued participation with our criminal justice system. So we cannot look at interpersonal violence in the silo, but we must pour the resources in to make sure that we are effective in making the changes that are necessary. Again, the statistics bear out that what we are doing is not working. And we as a community, as Nashvillians, I know this city, I love the city as a nonprofit community. I know that we can reimagine together together. And I have a very specific plan on how we do that. I encourage you to go do some light reading on it and understand that you are invited to the table in a meaningful way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nellis. Thank you to each of our candidates here today who have taken time out of their schedules to share their views for the future with us. We really appreciate the effort that you all put into campaigning to ensure that we're educated about your positions and about your desires for the future of Nashville. This is such an important position, and I commend each of you for your willingness to not only identify the issues, but to try and stand up and be a part of whatever solution you believe is appropriate. So specifically, thank you, General Funk. Thank you, Ms. Myers. Thank you, Ms. Nellis, for the time you have shared and for the words you have given us here today. I'd be remiss if I ended this without ensuring that we also thank those persons and organizations that are members of the Nashville Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and specifically those who were a part of bringing this event here today. We want to thank Agape Morning Star Sanctuary, Legal Aid Society of Middle Tennessee and the Cumberlands, the Mary Parrish Center, Nashville Children Alliance, Our Kids, the Sexual Assault Center, You Have the Power, and the YWCA of Nashville and Middle Tennessee. Additionally, I'd like to ensure that if there is anyone who's interested in being becoming a part of the Nashville Coalition Against Domestic Violence, you can go to our website at NashvilleCADV.com. That's NashvilleCADV.com. Additionally, for those who may not be aware, Metro Nashville is very privileged in that we do in fact have a department set aside and dedicated to domestic violence, interpersonal violence, sexual assault, trafficking, and other crime victim issues. That facility, that department is the Office of Family Safety, and it is located in the Family Safety Center. The Family Safety Center is located at 610 Murfreesboro Pike, Nashville, Tennessee, 37210. If you are interested in learning more or getting information as a victim, you can call the Family Safety Center at 615-880-1100. Going to the Family Safety Center, it is a free service and it is open to the public and the community for those persons who are seeking additional information and or safety. Going there, you can receive safety planning, danger assessment, orders of protection, counseling, crisis intervention, shelter or housing assistance, emergency food assistance, children's services, support groups, address confidentiality assistance, domestic violence education, and most importantly, you can receive referrals to any of the agencies that I've mentioned here today, and even more within our community who focus on the issue of domestic violence, interpersonal violence, sexual assault, stalking, and trafficking. So as we bring today's event to a close, again, I'd like to thank everyone for your attendance and to take the time to learn more about what is so important in our community. Thanks again to our candidates who are here today and to our fabulous timekeeper, Ms. Tina Fox. I hope you all have a great rest of the morning. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.